Okay, today we need to discuss the schools of literary criticism. Now, these schools don't only apply to analyzing short stories. You can analyze anything using the schools of literary criticism. And we actually did a little bit of this when we were going through the poetry unit. You can use them on short stories, novels, plays, TV shows, movies. I mean, there's no end to the kind of text you can use. So when I say these schools of literary criticism, let's think about what that means for a moment. The criticism can also be called theory. So the schools of literary theory would be another way to talk about this. The theories being, in many cases, other majors that you're looking at in the university. So we have psychological criticism, historical criticism, sociological criticism. Biographical doesn't fit, but we have gender criticism. CU doesn't have a gender crit emphasis anywhere right now, so we don't have feminine studies or feminist studies, I should say, and we don't have gender studies. Other larger universities do, however. So that's an actual major that other people can have at huge, usually state schools. So it's kind of like taking one of the other majors and crossing it over the top of English. But it's something that can serve you even when dealing with nonfiction texts. So, we're just going to talk about a few of them. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, because we don't have time, frankly. Alright, biographical criticism. The school of biographical criticism considers the text based on the author's life. So they're going to, like in the case of Everyday Use, which is a story you will be reading, they would look at the life of Alice Walker and what she experienced, and then they would look at her story, Everyday Use, and they would draw parallels between her experiences and what happens in the story. So that kind of author's life focus. In the poem Introduction to Poetry, Billy Collins actually asks his students to not obsess about this too much. It's actually part of what he's saying, wave at the author's biography as you jet ski past it. He's like, okay, don't get stuck here. Great, but it is a useful lens as long as you don't obsess too hard. Historical criticism, straightforwardly, takes history and looks at the history of the text. Okay, so what do I mean? I mean that the person who is focusing on historical criticism is going to look at what the text meant to the original audience. So one of their concerns is, how does a text change meaning over time? How do we potentially misunderstand this text now, here in the present? Because they're really considering, what did it mean to the original audience? What did it mean to the original author? So they're going to look at the social context of when this was written, the cultural context of where this was written, and any other intellectual factors, such as common philosophies believed at the time, psychological theories believed at the time that we now know are wrong, anything like that, where they look at that huge historical context around this text and the audience that received this text. So, the actual time period and culture, etc., around the text. If you go to church, then your preachers and or Sunday school teachers might actually be doing this a lot with the Bible. They will say things like, well, at the time when Jesus lived, Samaritans and Jews hated each other, and the Jews were very much disgusted by the Samaritans. So when Jesus said, this is a story about a good Samaritan, all the other supposedly good Jews walked past this injured man and didn't care, but the person who stopped and helped was a Samaritan. This had an extreme impact on the original audience because of their feelings about Samaritans. That's actually an example of historical criticism. Alright, so let's talk about psychological criticism. Psychological criticism really began by focusing on Freud at the very beginning. So, Freud's theories about sexuality, about the unconscious mind, which we also now call the subconscious mind, and then things such as the Oedipal complex, also called the Oedipus complex, and its partner, the Electra complex, featured originally. The Oedipal complex you actually need to know about. We looked at it in the poem Daddy, and we're going to look at it again in A Rose for Emily, which is, according to Freud's theory, when you are a toddler, you fall in love with your opposite sex parent, and you want to kill your same sex parent so you can marry your opposite sex parent. He said that every child went through this phase, and if they didn't leave this phase and transfer their libido off onto someone they're not related to, that they developed this complex. For men, the Oedipus complex. For women, it was called the Electra complex. We've basically dumped the term Electra complex, and we now just call it all Oedipal complex. It's based on an ancient play called Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex. That's where the name comes from. So Freud came first, and some authors literally wrote with Freud's theories in mind. That is the case with the poem Daddy. Sylvia Plath was consciously aware of Freud's theory and said that she made the speaker of the poem have Electra complex. So sometimes authors do this right there on the surface, and other times the person using psychological criticism is digging out things that the author is not consciously aware of. The next psychologist really pulled into this was actually Jung, and his theories concerning personality, and he was very much obsessed with archetypes, ancient archetypes that we still carry with us. The archetype of the good father, the archetype of the evil father, likewise the good mother and the evil mother, the archetype of the lover, the archetype of the femme fatale, like these kinds of archetypes. So looking through that kind of psychological lens and considering what the text is showing us. And then it just basically expanded, so at this point you can use any psychological theory you want to. So, you know, in the kind of original Freudian way, you would be looking at what is emotionally repressed in this text, like what is unconscious and running underneath the surface that the author probably isn't even aware of. Or you could be much more explicit about it and actually consider, you know, what kind of psychological disorder does this character have? Or, you know, in a case of crossing biographical criticism with psychological criticism, the author had a psychological disorder and is now writing about that psychological disorder, and how does that disorder play out in this work? That kind of thing. Alright, so let's move on to sociological criticism, which obviously is going to take the field of sociology and look at a text with it. So, let's talk about it generically first. Sociological criticism is looking at the political context. It is looking at the economic context, so socioeconomic context, and the cultural context. Alright, so let me write that down. Cultural context, political context, and the economic or socioeconomic context of the text. So they're looking at both ways. They're looking at the way that the text was written, like what were the cultural, political, and economic contexts at work in the society of the author who was writing this work, and how did they shape the way that they portrayed this work. You know, in modern day United States, we could say the text has a lot of Republican or Democratic ideology in it, for example. That would be a very specific example. The text could be exploring the economics of the poor, anything like that. But they also look at the context with which the text is received. So they're looking at the people, the audience, and their society, and they're saying, okay, what cultural forces, what political forces, and what economic forces shape the way the audience reacts to this work, how they received it, in other words. So if someone is trying to make economic commentary about poverty, and that cultural moment is very heightened, there's a heightened awareness of the issues of poverty, and the author misses the mark, there's going to be a lot of backlash from the audience. They're going to say, you didn't portray this accurately, you didn't portray it fairly, you said you cared about this, but all you really did was just mouth off a bunch of political BS from the rich, for example. So that would be a sociological reaction from the audience that is in alignment with sociological criticism. The number one thing about sociological criticism is art is not made in a vacuum. In other words, when you go to write something and when you go to read something, there is no way for you to pull your politics, your socioeconomic class, and your culture out of yourself so that it does not come out of you and into your text as a writer, and so that it does not color the way you read something when you read it as the reader. So they're saying, you are not in a vacuum. You are going to react to this based on your culture. And that is probably clearer right now than it usually is, because we are capable of importing books, TV series, and movies from other countries. We have a lot of anime coming in from Japan. We have a lot of British movies and Canadian movies coming in. We occasionally have French movies come in. And also a lot of British TV shows. You can find all sorts of shows on Netflix now and other streaming services. So there's a lot of interaction with other people's media, their stories, and something that someone who is from Britain might find hysterically funny, the US audience just goes, they don't get it, they don't get why it's funny. So those kinds of cultural impacts, that context, matters. Alright, so I want to cover another one briefly. I don't want to make this video too long. But I want to talk about gender criticism. And I did upload my lecture notes to Moodle, so you can actually see all of everything that I have to say. So go and look through those. There are more schools of criticism there, and they're more detailed on the ones I'm talking about. So, gender crit. In the beginning, gender criticism was feminism criticism, so feminist theory. So this meant that the mostly female theorists were looking at texts and also authors and considering, all these texts are male produced. There's an imbalance in the literary canon in which about 98% of all the people who've been canonized are dead white men, and there are almost no women there, and also almost no one of color is there. So in the beginning, when they first started doing feminist theory, they were fighting not only for the inclusion of women in the canon, but also people of color in the canon, regardless of whether they were male or female. So they looked at patriarchal assumptions that show up in text, and sexism that would show up in a text, and then they would consider, what the text was saying and what the impact was on the audience. So that's actually where we started with this. So you can actually thank the feminist critics or theorists for fighting to include something other than dead white guys who have been gone for centuries now in the canon, so that you can read something that's frankly probably a lot less confusing and boring because really old English. Let's face it, it's hard to read. That actually ended up creating post-feminism or post-feminist theory, in which the original theorists said, this theory doesn't work all the way, so they revised it, and then it's called post-feminism. This is something that happens a lot in literary criticism. We have Marxism and post-Marxism. We have modernism and postmodernism. It just happens. Anytime someone revises a theory to try to make it more accurate to reality, it ends up being called post. Or in the case of upgrading the use of historical criticism, they call it new historicism. Then gender criticism was the third stage. So gender crit got created when the gender studies kind of expanded. So we have men's studies, we have feminist studies, and then there's just a major that's gender studies, where you just kind of look at gender, which is the sociological construct, and then your physical sex, which is a biological you, and how the biological sex and the gender performance of the writer and the readers controls how the writer writes the text and also how the readers respond to the text. So this is actually a very complex school as far as all the different things it's looking at. They also look at sexual orientation, although after a while there was so much discussion of the impact of the sexual orientation of both the author and the readers that there was a breakout school. They broke off. They called themselves, I'm not kidding, queer theory, because they decided to make the word queer mean something good instead of something bad. So queer theory specifically looks at LGBTQIA questions and concerns and issues and portrayals. You know, portrayals by the authors, and then again, the way the audience responds to it based on their own sexuality. So it's a whole school of theory just by itself now. Alright, so we need to stop there because this video is getting really long. But again, please go look at the lecture notes and get a little more information. You will be asked to apply this to stories as we go through this unit.